is my pleasure to introduce you to today's Primetime, and especially today's 10-year celebration of Primetime. And I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Marion Larson and Dr. Shady as our guests and presenters for today. Marion's been at Bethel since 1986. She's professor of English, and her doctorate's from the University of Minnesota. Sara is a professor of philosophy at Bethel, has been here since 2002, and her PhD is from the University of South Carolina. When Ann Gannon and Carol Craig approached me about a 10-year celebration for Primetime, I think it's fair to say I said yes, like before you finished asking about it, because it was such a great idea. Primetime has become a really important part of our life together as a community. It's a place where faculty and students bring ideas they're thinking about, bring work that they're in the middle of, bring work that they're done with, bring ideas that they think might be half-baked, but they want input on them. It's become a really important time on our campus, and the fact that it's now 10 years old is indeed something to celebrate. As soon as we decided together, which took about 30 seconds, that yes, we're going to do a 10-year celebration, then we said, well, what should we do? And my first thought really was to ask Dr. Larson and Dr. Shady to talk about the work they've been doing with Interfaith Engagement. And there's lots of reasons why that made sense. Number one, I think it embodies what Primetime is about. They've been developing this line of focus for a number of years. And it's been something that as lifelong learners, they've leaned into and learned about, and now are leading efforts across our country. I love working with Marion and Sara because they have these ideas, and I know they're going to do something far beyond what I would imagine. So when they said, yeah, they met with me in 2011 and said, we have this idea. And I thought, oh, okay, what are they thinking? And they came in to talk about interfaith engagement. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Bethel should be involved in. So this embodies what Primetime is about. Interfaith engagement is critical for our world. When we look at what's happening in our world today, we need to be preparing our students to understand people with a variety of faiths and to be able to engage well and to live well in a diverse world. And third, Marion and Sara are really leading amazing work in this area. In 2011, they launched a team of Bethel folks to work on interfaith engagement, have been involved nationally, have developed a partnership with St. Thomas in Augsburg, published the book that we're delighted to give you today, are now engaging our faculty in how do you talk about interfaith engagement and how do you pay attention to that in the classroom. 3 grants. Marion and Sara have gotten 2 grants and helped another colleague get a 3rd grant in this area. So this epitomizes what Primetime is about. It's really important work, and the work that they're doing is really remarkable. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say today. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Harless. And when we first had that conversation with Deb back in 2011, you used language in that conversation that we continue to love to share with others about why do we do interfaith work at Bethel. We want to know how to love our neighbors well in our own community, which is very religiously diverse in the Twin Cities and ethnically and culturally diverse, but really around the world. And several years ago, Marion and I started a hallway conversation before we knew each other very well about some people that we were both reading that overlapped, that turned into conversations about, we do a lot of things at Bethel well, but something that we could do better is preparing our students to enter a world that's very religiously diverse, and how do we cultivate and sustain healthy relationships with peers and colleagues and neighbors and students in our classroom and coworkers in the cubicle next to us who are of a different faith, and what does it mean to really build some momentum in that direction. So here we are several years later. We started publishing articles together that then turned into this book, From Bubble to Bridge, which was published in 2017. This work began largely as part of an initiative out of the White House in 2011 to get college campuses around the country involved in interfaith community service projects. So we would take students, we utilized our Frogtown Summit University partnership for a lot of those activities, taking students into St. Paul to do community gardening or cleaning up a senior center, or meeting in a mosque or a church or a different house of worship to do projects together and then talk about, well, what does service mean in each of our religious traditions? And to share a meal together is just a starting place to think about how do we begin to build relationships of understanding and empathy. That work has grown in partnership along the years with Interfaith Youth Corps, which is the national leader in interfaith engagement on college campuses. Around 500 colleges started with that initiative back in 2011, and now several thousand colleges work with Interfaith Youth Corps, including Bethel. And Ibu Patel, who is the president and founder of Interfaith Youth Corps, generously offered to write the foreword to our book, and we were quite honored to have him do that. So thank you to Dr. Harless and her office for providing the complimentary copies of the books today. So if you haven't taken one yet, please feel free to grab one on your way out. Today we're going to do a combination of reading some sections from our book, as well as stopping to talk along the way about some of the ideas about why we do this work, what this work looks like at Bethel, and why we think this is important work for the larger Christian community outside of our campus to continue to be involved in.
So this is some of the reading part. And we... Sara and I have spent most of our lives living and working in bubbles. Those of you associated with Bethel are pretty familiar with that term. It's a term often used to describe the relatively homogeneous culture of many evangelical colleges and universities. As a student, I spent 4 years inside the Wheaton bubble, and Sara spent her college years within the Taylor bubble. Now we've worked together for several years, I should say these many years for me, inside the Bethel bubble. Bubbles don't exist only around college campuses, however. Whether we're involved in a club or an organization, a classroom or dormitory or church, bubbles form whenever we draw clear boundaries between us and them. And when we focus most of our time and energy in the safety of us. From our experience, bubbles aren't entirely bad, but they are definitely limiting. Bubbles provide a relatively safe space for us to be ourselves. They help affirm and solidify our identities among others with similar beliefs, and that was very much my experience as a student at Wheaton and Sara's at Taylor. And bubbles provide respite from the challenges of the world around us. But staying in bubbles doesn't prepare us for life in the 21st century. Life inside a bubble often fails to help us see the world from other perspectives because it doesn't provide enough opportunity for building meaningful and constructive relationships with people who believe differently, the kind of relationships we'll need if we hope to face myriad global challenges. Bubbles isolate. As Ibu Patel puts it, religion in the 21st century can be a bubble of isolation, a barrier of division, a bomb of destruction, or a bridge of cooperation. Patel has described the challenge and the opportunity of religious diversity in his book, Acts of Faith. Mirroring W.E.B. Du Bois's famous statement that the problem of the 20th century is the color line, Patel suggests that the 21st century will be shaped by the question of the faith line. In response to this challenge, we believe, along with Patel and many others, that we must leave our bubbles and build bridges of cooperation and collaboration that connect people of different faiths. For over a decade, as Sara described, a movement has been spreading across college campuses to inspire and engage students, faculty, and staff in this crucial work. A problem, however, is that many Christians, particularly evangelicals, are not seen as bridge builders. Although there are many different reasons for this, some of which are certainly rooted in stereotypes and misunderstanding, we as Christians must accept the fact that society at large does not perceive us as being all that good at loving our neighbors, particularly when our neighbors belong to a different religious tradition. I'm skipping a little bit. A common goal of education from a Christian perspective is to cultivate a mature intellect and faith.
one that enables us to lead lives of meaningful service as we actively engage and seek to transform the world. Over the years, much has been written by Christian academics about the integration of faith and learning. And this scholarship continues to discuss the importance of helping students to learn to weave together the academic, social, and spiritual aspects of their lives. Many recent works on Christian higher education have considered what faith-learning integration might look like in the 21st century. However, little attention is given to preparing Christian students to navigate a religiously diverse world. Christians need to be more intentional about preparing to love their neighbors, even perhaps especially when those neighbors have different religious beliefs. For those on campuses like ours, such preparation needs to include interfaith service and dialogue on and off campus as an important aspect of education and spiritual development. The type of interfaith engagement that Sara and I prescribe isn't about fostering theological relativism. We're not asking Christians to accept the beliefs of other religions as theological truth. Rather, we recognize that while we all might pray in separate mosques, churches, synagogues, and temples, we still share schools, stores, and streets. Thus, interfaith engagement is about improving these common social spaces and building understanding between communities. This is clearly consistent with the goal of many Christians to be positive agents of transformation in the world.
So as we think about how this fits within the context of higher education and specifically at Bethel, we think about the fact that while higher education exists largely to help students develop intellectually and gain information they previously lacked, learning isn't just a matter of acquiring subject matter. Instead, learning is both cognitive and affective, involving the whole person. Education worthy of its name is essentially education of character, says Martin Buber. Among other things, this means that even if a student acquires impressive amounts of information, true education hasn't necessarily occurred. Bethel has long recognized this. We're committed to holistic education. We see integration of faith and learning as central to an education, so faculty and staff work hard to develop and help students consider how their faith commitments might influence their scholarship and academic learning, as well as how their academic learning might affect their faith. We look for ways to help students connect their experiences in the dorm, or in service projects, or in chapel with their classroom learning, and vice versa. As an example, consider the mission statement of Bethel University. Boldly informed and motivated by the Christian faith, Bethel University educates and energizes men and women for excellence in leadership, scholarship, and service. A common phrase used to describe Bethel's educational goal is that we want to help students and ourselves become whole and holy persons, meaning that education must be simultaneously spiritual, intellectual, and social. Holistic education requires challenge and support, and in order to promote learning, a recurring theme among much educational literature, challenge nudges the learner into new territory, stretching her beyond her current way of thinking or acting. Support helps encourage and motivate and reassure a learner that she's capable of meeting the challenge. This is true in faith development as well. Research shows that a prime factor in faith development is the sort of challenge that leads people to examine what they believe and why, and along with support needed for reflecting on what's been encountered. For the most part, Bethel does a great job of supporting students in the development of a mature and informed faith. But do we provide enough challenge? And that's one of the questions that really inspired Marion and I on this work several years ago. While students who attend Bethel have many productive opportunities to develop their Christian faith, interactions with those from other religious traditions are often limited. Students may emerge as fluent speakers of Christian, but we also want to help our students become theologically bilingual, to understand the God language of another community, and to understand our own more clearly in the process. Developing religious literacy across faith traditions involves following Warren Nord's advice to take religion seriously, meaning that religion is understood from the inside, studied in sufficient depth to make sense of it, treated as a live option in its most compelling forms. We often meet Nord's goal when it comes to Christianity, but a relevant question for Christians to ask is, are we taking other religions seriously as well? Not only is answering this question in the affirmative a matter of justice and equity, it's also essential for the intellectual, spiritual, and social development of Christian college students. In fact, extensive research on the degree to which college students exhibit a pluralistic orientation towards others, marked by a move from tolerance towards engagement, acceptance, and understanding of diverse worldviews, is lowest among evangelical college students. We simply can't constructively engage and serve the world beyond our campus if we don't learn how to navigate religious diversity constructively, balancing religious commitment with hospitality and openness toward others. Based on years of experience and research, we've come to believe that the goal of holistic education can be met only through interactions with members of other faith traditions. Such interactions help to humanize religious others, making dialogue and reconciliation possible, as well as encouraging reflection on one's own faith tradition and subsequent spiritual growth within that tradition.
Okay, if you decide to read the book that you have received, what we've just read is a little bit from our introduction, and the first couple of chapters after the introduction, we provide some additional information establishing a civic argument for interfaith engagement. We provide some information trying to move people towards starting to think about possible theological arguments for such engagement. The chapter we're going to focus on for the next few minutes is a chapter in which we talk about what kind of character qualities do we need to cultivate in ourselves and in our students in order to make productive interfaith engagement, productive. And even before Sara and I started thinking specifically about interfaith engagement, as faculty members at a place like Bethel, we think about cultivating students as whole people, which of course then leads us to ask, who do we hope our students become, not just what are they learning in the classroom, but who do we hope they're going to become, and who do we hope we're becoming in the process. So that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit now, and I think I have a lovely, we already mentioned about challenge and support. Okay. We're skipping the part of the chapter where we talk in a little bit more detail about two of the authors we're drawing from fairly heavily in this chapter, but in case this sounds interesting to you, these are two books I would recommend to you, one by Catherine Cornell and one by Martha Nussbaum. Some people of faith who might applaud many goals of interfaith dialogue are still concerned about what might be lost in the process. Afraid that dialogue will water down or even erase the significant differences among religions, some religiously committed people choose not to participate. Yet dialogue is an important tool in increasing interfaith understanding and averting conflict. For this reason, campuses like Bethel need to be places where such productive conversation is fostered, and where all students, faculty, and staff can learn to talk, listen, and work with religious others in preparation for participation in a pluralistic society. Ultimately, we need to develop qualities that make us well-suited for such participation. And so the three qualities we're going to focus on for the next few minutes are, first, receptive humility, then reflective commitment, and finally, imaginative empathy. And we'll talk a little bit about how we're using those terms. And one of the points we want to make is each of these is necessary, but each one by itself is not sufficient. It's really a combination of these that's important. And I already mentioned we're drawing largely from the work of Catherine Cornell and Martha Nussbaum. And so now Sara is going to talk about receptive humility.
Receptive humility is crucial if we hope to avoid the bias and hypocrisy often present in religious dialogue. As Nussbaum explains, too often religious persons fail to heed Jesus' question in Matthew 7:3. And why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? Interactions with persons who believe differently is healthier and more constructive when we're all willing, in humility, to acknowledge the limitations of our own religious views and our need to learn from others. Humility functions as an antidote to bias and misunderstanding when it's open, a curious questioning and receptive demeanor that says, in effect, here's another human being. I wonder what he or she is feeling and seeing right now. This receptive aspect of humility is rooted in a desire to seek and receive truth, whether that comes in the form of learning more about why I believe what I believe, coming to recognize the limitations of my own perspectives, or deepening my understanding of those who are different from me. Many evangelical Christians aren't comfortable submitting their beliefs to such a degree of scrutiny. In fact, some are troubled when their fellow dialogue participants or facilitators ask them to do this. But even these Christians, unwilling to practice what Cornell refers to as doctrinal humility, can still pursue receptive humility by being open to constant correction while seeking to understand what dialogue partners are actually saying. For some participants, simply beginning to notice similar practices, shared values, and common goals between people from different faith traditions is real progress and can be a more productive starting point. Even if interfaith discussions don't go much beyond this level, which at times might feel superficial, there still exists the possibility of someone hearing something for the first time, something they came to consider of real value to explore and to build on. This may be a piece of relatively basic information about another religion. It may be the recognition that religious others can share one's own spiritual concerns or find similar practices edifying. Yet each of these realizations helps cultivate receptive humility. Receptive humility can be developed through interfaith dialogue when such encounters provide the opportunity to reconsider one's own beliefs in a more objective way, viewed through the vantage point of another. This can be difficult and challenging, but it's important. Receptive humility grows as we continue to ask questions and desire to know more. This goes on to fuel the pursuit of ongoing interfaith engagement. One of the biggest challenges to cultivating humility, however, can arise for those convinced of the absolute and final truth of their own religion. They may find themselves listening for flaws in what their dialogue partner is saying and mentally preparing for ways to show the superiority of their own beliefs. We often don't spend enough time listening because we're so quick to be thinking about how we're going to refute. The preconceptions about their own faith and that of others make it difficult for them to listen receptively and see the many parallels among their own beliefs and those of others. For such a person, simply becoming aware of the tendency to find fault in others' religious beliefs is itself the beginning of humility.
I mentioned earlier that the combination of these qualities is part of what's important. So receptive humility is a quality that would challenge us to be willing to ask, do a lot of self-scrutiny and be open to correction. Reflective commitment kind of pulls things, I don't want to say in the opposite direction, but in a slightly different direction. While receptive humility is a crucial condition for constructive dialogue, it's not sufficient. Healthy interfaith engagement should also provide opportunities for participants to sincerely express their religious beliefs and commitments. Commitment to one's religious tradition provides both a solid point of departure and a critical place of return. How does commitment relate to dialogue? Catherine Cornell says that authentic dialogue contains, and these are her words, a missionary and an apologetic dimension. This is the case, she continues, because religious identity includes seeing one's own beliefs and practices as worthy of commitment, as the lens through which the world is understood and evaluated. So it should come as no surprise when one of our students, having sought to convince others in his interfaith dialogue group of the truth of Christianity, said, "The way I understand it is they should feel honored that I would be willing to share the truth with them rather than not share." There's an obvious challenge here for interfaith engagement. We must learn to balance our commitments and our convictions with receptive humility. In our dialogues and then our reflections together with our students, we need to ask how we might affirm both the virtues of open-mindedness and of faithfulness to a tradition. Those who find openness to come naturally may need to cultivate respect for those who desire to convert others to their own commitments. Those who possess a strong commitment to their own tradition, as is the case with many of our students, they may need to be reassured that a person can listen, can seek to understand, and can even come to appreciate aspects of another religion without compromised commitment to one's own faith. In our interaction with our religious neighbors, we need to learn when to leave some issues off the table, when to listen, when to speak, and when to focus on common ground rather than on differences. All who participate in interfaith dialogue can strive together to develop the sort of reflective commitment that includes the ability to think deeply and critically about fundamental questions in general, as well as about one's own fundamental beliefs, attachments, and presuppositions. Reflective commitment is evident in those who are aware both of the reasons why they remain committed to their own beliefs and the reasonable grounds for doubting them. It can be seen in those who are willing to entertain tough questions without abandoning the beliefs that one is still investigating or allowing others to question. For commitment to be truly reflective, we must be willing to engage in what Martha Nussbaum refers to as Socratic scrutiny, or rigorous critical thinking. Socratic scrutiny involves an ongoing critical examination of oneself and one's beliefs, seeking to live what Socrates called the unexamined life, which we all know is live the examined life, because we all know the unexamined life is not worth living. Scrutiny of our own beliefs doesn't mean we have to avoid critiquing other religions and simply ignore the significant differences between them, though. Rather, it involves developing a more reflective understanding of one's own position in light of an increasingly more accurate understanding of another's position. In finding a balance between humility and commitment, we come to recognize that it is possible to admire an aspect of another religious tradition without weakening our commitment to our own. In fact, what I value in another tradition may actually help to strengthen my own religious practice. Our students have had the opportunity to experience this. Several have admiringly noted the commitment displayed by Jews and Muslims that they encountered, observing that Christians could certainly learn from such devotion. And now Sara is going to talk about the third quality, which is imaginative empathy.
Just yesterday in CWC, so for some of those of you who are alums, yes, we still teach that. Professor Mulberry was teaching, so yes, he still teaches that course. And he was introducing students to the concept of medieval Christianity, and he invited them to think about the past, learning about the past as traveling in a foreign country. And when we travel in a foreign country, we try to be good travelers to really understand what it's like to live in that place and to try to see that world through the eyes of the people who live there and be sensitive to their way of understanding. And he talked about if we do that well, we're really cultivating empathy. And so when we talk about imaginative empathy, we're thinking about the respect that we can have for other persons that helps us really hold humility and commitment together, that enables us to simultaneously do both of those. Both Cornell and Nussbaum recognize that empathy is a cognitive as well as moral virtue. It involves a desire to learn intellectually about another religion and its adherents, as well as a willingness and ability to penetrate into the religious mindset of the other and understand him or her from within. For this to occur, says Cornell, we must have sympathy for the religious other, which includes personal warmth and affection toward the other person, but also openness to the meaningfulness and worth of his or her religious life. It includes respect for and interest in the beliefs and practices of the other. Empathy involves humanizing the other, seeking to get to know members of other religious communities in direct and personal ways, So often religion and our knowledge of religious others just comes from media portrayals and stereotypes. And so we're inviting students and ourselves to think about, how do I get to know this person as a human first? And then that enables me to see inside and understand the religious views. At minimum, such I'll skip ahead. Some of our students, particularly those who have participated in off-campus interfaith dialogues and service projects, have subsequently developed relationships with those that they met and go beyond this recognition to begin challenging their own beliefs. A person seeking to reflect seriously on their own beliefs may have to exercise imagination in order to consider what the other's beliefs and practices might mean and what they look like from the inside. This sort of imaginative empathy includes the ability to think what it might be like to be in the shoes of a person different from oneself, to be an intelligent reader of that person's story, and to understand the emotions and desires that someone so placed might have. In cultivating such an imagination, we're starting to understand difference from a new vantage point. This in turn helps us to realize, on a deeper level, that our neighbors are not forbiddingly alien and other. We actually share many of the same problems and possibilities. Those who come to see the admirable qualities in the beliefs and practices of others often articulate part of what Cornell refers to as interconnection. Simply put, interconnection is a sense of commonality and solidarity among religions and of the relevance of the other religion for one's own religious tradition. Interconnection might mean sharing common concerns over issues such as environmental destruction, justice for the poor, and the role of religion in civil society. It also might mean identifying universal features of various religions, including a sense of being in life that transcends this world's selfish little interests, a commitment to self-surrender, freedom, and loving and harmonious affections. And that was a quote of Cornell. And again, remember that we're not advocating a theological pluralism when we're talking about acknowledging these common overlaps. This is held in tension with reflective commitment. But we're thinking about, how do I build an ongoing, lifelong, healthy relationship with another person where I remain committed to my faith, whether or not that person converts to my religious tradition. Some Christians are even surprised when empathy is easiest and hardest to cultivate. Most of our students expect to find compatriots with their fellow Christian interfaith dialogue participants, assuming common theological commitments and concerns. Instead, they frequently notice that there's as much spiritual difference within most particular religious narratives or traditions as there is between and among different religious groups. And one of the exciting opportunities that this work has for us on campus is the possibility of intra-faith dialogue. How do we get the Catholic and the Lutheran students to understand they're both members of the same tree? Imaginative empathy doesn't require agreement with or endorsement of the views held by another person, but it does help us see and feel the depth of others' commitments, to learn that the other worlds of thought and feelings exist. Nussbaum places 3 important conditions on imaginative capacity that aim to protect against misuse and misappropriation of this crucial skill. First, imaginative empathy must be rooted in an ethical commitment to do no harm. This means that I genuinely have concern and sympathy for the other as a fellow human being. At the same time, however, I don't have to accept or endorse any religious practices that violate the rights of others or that harm others. Critique is at times necessary, but critique must always be informed. This leads to Nussbaum's second condition. Imaginative empathy must be rooted in factual truth. We must be sure we attempt to genuinely and accurately understand the other's views before we criticize them. Third, Nussbaum emphasizes that the purpose of imaginative empathy is crucial. We shouldn't use this capacity to manipulate others. For example, I fail to show empathy if my singular motive for building a relationship with a person of a different faith is to convert this person. That can be a goal, but I dehumanize the other person if that's my only goal. When we cultivate imaginative empathy, we reach a central goal of interfaith interaction, balancing receptive humility and reflective commitment. We learn to think and speak reflectively and respectfully about various ways of life through taking time to listen and empathize, entering imaginatively into another person's story. This never requires a hands-off attitude to criticism of what one encounters. This balance between openness and honesty, between a willingness to change and a desire to remain true to one's commitments, is articulated well by one of the participants in the Faith Club. And there's a book about this club. It's an interfaith discussion group and support group that's described in a book of the same name. Speaking of the impact of her years as an involvement in this group, a participant said, "I still speak as a Jew, but now I speak as a Jew with a Palestinian friend."
So we've talked a bit about 3 particular virtues that we seek to cultivate in ourselves and in our students that we think are especially important when it comes to interfaith engagement. In the branch of ethics called virtue ethics, talking about cultivation of virtue, cultivation of virtue is not merely about becoming a good person, but the ultimate goal of becoming virtuous is pointing beyond the self toward ways in which we can establish a better form of life together. There's always a social goal to that. So thus we must think beyond ourselves to the role that receptive humility, reflective commitment, and imaginative empathy can play in developing friendships and ultimately in cultivating peace. According to Rabbi Amy Eilberg, the fundamental work of peace building is for us to move beyond generalized thinking about the other and instead come to see the other as a trustworthy and admirable human being, even in the presence of real religious and or ideological difference. The virtues needed for and deepened by interfaith engagement do just that. This is the part where we just repeat what we've already said, so I'm going to skip that, but I'm going to add one more sentence. As I engage with those who believe differently from me, I practice using what Diana Eck calls bridging speech. Bridging speech is the ability to communicate across faith lines, and that is certainly a skill needed for effective common action. Okay, I think we can be done talking about this chapter.
Right, and so I thought we'll take a break from reading and talk concretely about some of the suggestions that are in the book, but that speaking from a Christian perspective, one of our strongest motivations for this work is Jesus reduces the entire law to the 2 commands of loving God and loving your neighbor. And our neighbor includes religious others. The Samaritans were religious others in Jesus' world. And how do we think about loving our neighbors well when they're from a different religious tradition? So we thought we'd talk through a few things that all of us can practice and think about implementing in our daily lives. First of all, practice hospitality. We know that hospitality has a long tradition within the Christian community. And thinking specifically about how that virtue of hospitality can be applied when our guest is a religious other. And actually thinking about navigating the world as myself as a host and the religious other as my guest. And that transforms how I think about them. Now, a lot of what we're talking about, remembering that the goal is loving my religious neighbor, means we have to bracket out fear. And that fear cannot be the primary emotion or driver when we're interacting with religious others. If we move from a place of love, theoretically, we're thinking, about the way in which the early Christians welcomed the strangers. Who was invited to sit at the feet of and eat with at the table of Jesus? And how did he interact with them? What does that look like in your 21st century world with the neighbors of a different faith tradition who live down the street, or the coworker of a different faith tradition? Practically, being hospitable means being a good guest, learning some helpful rules and practices. Don't, if it's your chance to order lunch for your workplace and you have Muslim coworkers, don't order the pulled pork sandwich. Right? The very simple know-how that can help someone who's used to being on the margins of our society feel welcomed, feel understood, and feel acknowledged is an important step in loving our religious neighbors well. Along this line of loving our religious neighbors well, it's also important that we fight religious prejudice. And some of that came up in the talk about the chapter or the section on imaginative empathy and the rules of that. We certainly don't endorse any religion's claim to harm others or an interpretation of a religion's claim to harm others. But we also have to have our facts right. And we need to, as persons of love, be voices in our community and in our society and in our workplace and in our neighborhood about who our religious neighbors really are. Fighting religious prejudice, thinking about how do we speak out against Islamophobia in our society. When the mosque in Bloomington was bombed this summer, how do we as Christians respond in a way that we would want others to respond if it was a church that had been bombed? So again, being motivated by love, not by fear, means that we don't just, it makes me think of Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. It's not enough to just actively seek justice. We have to also actively fight injustice. So look for ways that you can actively fight and speak out against religious prejudice.
Refuse to bear false witness, and that's related to some of what Sara just talked about. I need to make sure that I have accurate information about the religious beliefs of people around me, so that I make sure that the words that come out of my mouth about what Muslims believe or what a certain branch of Christianity believes, for example, so that I make sure that the words I'm saying are true and not false. And sometimes I bear false witness if I keep my mouth shut when I actually should speak. I think of it's so tempting when there's news about an ISIS threat or about an ISIS attack, or if someone from a Christian from a Muslim majority country comes and speaks in a church about religious discrimination that they experienced living there. Those are facts of some parts of the world, but there are over 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. And the percentage of those who favor violence in the name of Islam, like ISIS, is similar to the percentage of those who claim to be Christian who are avowed white supremacists. And it's not fair. So the bearing false witness, fighting religious prejudice, is partly about having accurate information. It's partly about being willing to receive criticism as a Christian, and willing to apologize on behalf of Christians for the bad things that have been done in the name of Christianity, just as I need to, of course, be willing to critique Islam at times if that's appropriate, but to be so cautious about when and how, and to make sure that there's accurate information in what I'm saying. So much of this sounds so obvious to me, but I'm aware of the ways in which we don't do this. You know, we say we need to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. So that means, for example, if I want someone else to listen to me, try to convince them that they should become a Christian, I need to be willing to listen to someone else try to convince me that I should become a part of another religion, that trying to convince me that I'm wrong or that I'd be happier and more fulfilled. I need to, one of the people that we read talks about even thinking about the way we talk about our religious neighbors when they're not present. And I think that's a really big challenge at places like Bethel. I know that there are no Muslims in my classroom. And so if a student says something wrong and really offensive, it's easy to kind of let that go, because I'm pretty sure no one in the room will be offended. But just be talking as if others are physically present and thinking about then how should we speak about them even when they're not here. The photo here, this is an only okay book in my opinion, but the photo is, this is a mother and a daughter. The mother is Christian, the daughter was raised Christian, but as an adult converted to Islam. And the book The mom's last name is Raybon, R-A-Y-B-O-N. The book came out about a year or two ago, and the book consists of letters they wrote to each other, talking about how should they treat each other in love now, and some of the challenges they faced. I had higher expectations about the book, but anyway, to me, that this is part of their book is them struggling to learn to love each other. Anything else? Is there anything else we wanted to say about this? Oh, I forgot we had one more bullet on here. And we've already given some examples of this at the very beginning when Sara said some of the kinds of things we've done with our students, recognizing that there are a lot of physical needs in the world, a lot of them in our neighborhoods, and many people of various faith traditions also are motivated by their faith, just like Christians are, to care about fighting injustice, to care about improving schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And working with others for the common good can be a way to do actually physically good things while also developing relationships with each other in which it becomes absolutely natural to talk about, here's what motivates me to want to do good in the world. What motivates you to want to do good in the world? My dad used to be on Campus Crusade staff. I grew up in a home where going out and doing kind of cold calling evangelism was sort of expected. And I know I was never, ever effective at that. But talking about my faith in the context of a natural relationship that I'm developing and things that I have in common with someone I'm getting to know, that feels more loving and more Christ-like, I think.
And I think that sometimes we miss we miss the opportunities because we're not even thinking about them. That when our churches are engaged in, an effort to feed the hungry or to address homelessness or to work on an issue in the local community, think about what it might look like to invite the local Islamic center or synagogue or Sikh community or Baha'i community to partner with you in that. You increase your numbers and your resources, and you provide a great opportunity to be hospitable in your own community and cultivate some new friendships and some new pathways. So sometimes the opportunities are there and we're not seeing them or not even looking for them.
I'll just say one other thing. I think we skipped the reading from the last chapter because we kind of already talked about that. When Sara was talking about practicing hospitality, I guess just one other thing I would add here is the reminder that the Greek word that hospitality comes from has two sides to it. It's about what can you do to host someone else, and Sara gave some great examples of that. But it's equally about what does it mean to learn to be a gracious guest. And I think that as the Christians that I know are pretty good at thinking of ways to be good hosts, but not very good at learning to be good guests. So just, I say that as a challenge to remind me that that's important and as just sort of another concrete thing that might be helpful.
Yeah.
I don't remember if we have other
So
slides.
I think now would be a great time to just stop it.
Yes.
We'd love to interact with you if
Yes.
you have questions. We're happy to talk specifically about some of the projects that we have done in the past and some of the things we have coming up this year. But let us stop here and see what your questions are, what you'd like to hear more about. Yes.
Okay, so how I kind of put this in my mind is like through the Enlightenment, the church got swept up into that, into like it's all in your head, it's all about knowledge, it's all about being right. And so as you're talking about how Christian students come in, with this mindset that we've cultivated for generations, and the amount of deconstruction that has to take place is astounding to me, like to get to what you're saying. And I'm just wondering if you see like the current like post-Christian society that we're living in where truth has been totally deconstructed, could that possibly be a helpful thing in in deconstructing some of these the baggage that we come in with as Christians?
Thanks, Lisa. Yes, I think of two things kind of quickly that I want to say to that, and I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think historically, Western Christianity over the last few hundred years has focused on orthodoxy, being right in our belief, and we've forgotten about orthopraxy, the living out of our faith. I think one of the reasons why this work fits so well at Bethel is because of our pietist heritage, that faith must be lived out in action, and that we do try to emphasize orthopraxy, and this is a great opportunity for that. I would tell you, though, I'm surprised in a good way by how quickly personal relationships with other people deconstruct all the things that come, the baggage that a student might come in with. Just a quick story. Several years ago, several of us took students from some of our classes to a local Islamic center in the Frogtown neighborhood. We thought that we were going there because in the planning meeting we discussed this. We were going to talk about service in our different religious traditions and have a nice conversation about that. And when we got there, we were welcomed. We sat down and the imam decided to stand up and give a lecture on the superiority of Islam over Christianity. And then our students were invited to respond. And as a teacher, I'm thinking, how do I unpack this in the classroom tomorrow? What do I, is Provost Harless on the phone? We're going to be on the phone. The next day in class, I walked in and I said, wow, a student stopped me and said, Professor Shady, you don't have to worry about us. That was fantastic. Yeah. We talked all night in the dorm about what it was like to be in the shoes of someone being evangelized to instead of being the one sharing your faith. That was a great experience. And now we came up with this list of questions that we want to understand better about Christianity. And so that and it might be that their generation is different than ours, that there's a capacity for this, because I also think we live in a post 9/11 world where religion is a part of curriculum, even in public schools, and religious diversity is a part of social studies education in a way it wasn't when I was growing up. So I do think there's some capacities to talk into, but it's been really exciting to see how this actual engagement work goes miles towards that deconstruction.
Yeah, and the only thing that I would add is, I'll generalize. You're kind of asking a question that might tempt me to do that. I feel like many of my students fall into one of two categories. And in my opinion, neither a category is good, okay? One category is I'm so rigidly attached to the beliefs I brought to college that I would be untrue to Jesus and my mom and dad and my youth pastor if I let myself question any of them. And therefore, all Muslims are Muhammad was the Antichrist, et cetera. Okay, so there's that category. And then there's the dramatically opposite category that says, I know what I believe, that's good for me, but whatever you believe, that's good for you. Can't we all just get along? I need to be kinder and more loving to people, period. And in the chapter of our book where we talk about this, we that's sort of the tolerance approach, which is not the one that we would advocate. And we're trying to get students, not that the middle is always the right answer, but that this is back to that how can you be receptively humble, which the people that are tolerant are better at, and how can you be reflectively committed, that somehow there's some tension there, but you have to think about both. So some students need to be challenged in one direction, and some need to be challenged in a different direction.
Just really quickly, too, there's an exciting national study, a massive longitudinal study currently going on college students across America at school. The Bethel participates in it, so at small Christian colleges to state universities, that's longitudinally tracking what happens to their faith development as they encounter religious others, because our assumption is fear, like, if I take students to a mosque, what if they convert to Islam? the study is increasingly demonstrating that the opposite is true. The more our students do this, the deeper grounded in their own faith commitments they become. And that's really exciting, and that's what we would hope. And so it's great that we're now developing a body of data that supports that.
I think we have like 2 more minutes, if anyone has any other questions. Carol?
I was just wondering, because of the political divide in the world, how that interaction affects or impacts or is part of this grade of interaction at all.
That is absolutely dramatically the elephant in the room, I think. Sara mentioned we've been involved in a lot of things sponsored by and run by Interfaith Youth Corps. And we've also done some work with the local Interfaith Network, which has changed its name recently. It used to be come under the Minnesota St. Paul Area Council of Churches. And by and large, the majority of people, even from various religious traditions, who tend to involve themselves in things like that, tend to be politically progressive. So regardless of religion, what connects a lot of those people together is a similar way of thinking about being in the world, whether you're Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Hindu or Baha'i. So a lot of more people who are more politically conservative, regardless of their religion, often feel less at home there. And that's something that Sara and I have spoken into quite a bit.
It's so, a lot of the leaders in this movement see that as a limitation of the movement and are trying to think, how do we broaden this to better cross political lines? And Bethel being having a high percentage of evangelical students and faculty on our campus, we've actually are doing a lot of collaborative partnerships. On the one hand, to think, how do we do this kind of work at schools like ours? We're figuring it out. National organizations like Interfaith Youth Corps are figuring it out at the same time, and so there's a lot of momentum and partnership right now to try to lean into that and figure it out. But yes, in a lot of ways, the political divide is sharper than the religious divide right now.
Much. Partly because in our current climate, it seems that everyone feels that they have permission to say what they think in whatever horrible way they want to. And this is people on both sides, so I'm not pointing the finger at one person. I'm aware of how horribly I speak, say at the dinner table with my husband, about the people with whom we disagree. So there are so few models out there of ways of efforts to bridge divides and ways to talk honestly yet respectfully. So few models out there when we're talking about politics or religion, and anyway, so that's bad.
Is this the recipe for the political divide also? Would you advocate?
I think we need to also have how do I love my political neighbor? Yes.
Yeah.
I don't want to have that conversation. But I know that's me being utterly, absolutely hypocritical. That seems like, oh yes, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I don't know if you said this a little earlier in your presentation or not, but do you think this same concept would be useful in bridging the gap between denominations as well?
Absolutely, yes, that's one of our hopes, and a lot of our initiatives on campus this year are focused on interfaith because we have grant money funding them for those goals, but our long-term strategic plan of what we're doing involves intra-faith dialogue just as much, and I think in a lot of ways sometimes that's the harder work, is to figure out, right, how do I communicate with the person that is sort of like me and claims the same label as me, but I fundamentally disagree with. And that's really one of our hopes. And when you take a look at the book, each chapter is organized with some discussion questions and practical tips at the end, and the last several chapters have very specific things you can try doing. And the book was written that it could be used on a college campus, but also at a church, and that it could be used or at, to foster ecumenical discussion. So absolutely, thank you for acknowledging that for us. Yeah.
I know it's time to end, but I thought of one tiny concrete idea to just put on your radar once it gets to be about May. Ramadan, because it follows a lunar calendar, is at a different time each year. This year it occurs close to the end of Bethel's school year, so basically May. And at least in the Twin Cities, increasing numbers of mosques are reaching out and inviting anyone in the community who wants to join them for their iftar dinner. At the end of the day, that's when they meet to break the fast of the day and also to pray together. That's a really, really, I think, a fairly safe feeling. It's a way to show hospitality by being willing to be a guest in someone else's religious home, and a way to start getting to know neighbors. So kind of be on the lookout for information about that. Anyway, I've had really positive experiences bringing students to some of those and attending some of those myself. There's an Islamic center not far from Bethel's campus, like right across the street from the fairgrounds. And that's one where I went to an iftar last year, and I got the impression that they're definitely planning to continue that.
Sandy?
Former student friend of mine who is Muslim, he invited me to iftar with his family, the 3 kids and his wife and him. And he said, "Sandy, please don't be late because we are very hungry by that time."
Yeah.
Can I just interject something? As I've been sitting here listening to this, I just wanted to mention that we as Christians have the Holy Spirit living within us. And as we get into these situations where we're dealing with other religions and other, to pray and ask the Holy Spirit to guide our speech and our actions and what He would have us do in those situations. And some people plant, some people water, but to remember that we have the help that we need right within us to go to before we ever connect with other people.
Exactly. I think that's one of the best ways we cast out fear and move forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming, even if you came because here's a chance to go to a homecoming activity where you don't have to be in the rain. But thanks for that. Sara and I'll speak for me. I don't know what kind of schedule Sara has. I'm happy to stick around for a couple minutes if anyone has any questions or whatever. But thank you for coming. Sara and